In the past 5 years alone, archaeologists have uncovered evidence that's completely changing how we view biblical history. We're talking about the Tel Dan stele that references the House of David and Hezekiah bully bearing royal seals that confirm biblical kings. LiDAR technology has even revealed Assyrian military camps that match biblical battle accounts. What makes these discoveries so remarkable isn't just that they exist, but how precisely they align with biblical accounts. Until finds like the Tel Dan stele in 1993, key biblical figures lacked extra-biblical proof. Today we're examining the most significant archaeological finds of the last decade that are forcing historians to reconsider what they thought they knew about the Bible. Some of these discoveries started with the smallest artifacts imaginable. The seal that proved a prophet existed. The Tel Dan stele stands as one of archaeology's most significant biblical discoveries. This 9th century BC Aramean inscription, unearthed in northern Israel in 1993, contains a phrase that sent shockwaves through the archaeological community: House of David. The inscription reads, "I killed Jehoram son of Ahab king of Israel, and I killed Ahaziah son of Jehoram king of the House of David." This represents the first extra-biblical reference to the Davidic dynasty, providing concrete evidence that King David was not merely a legendary figure, but an actual historical ruler whose lineage was recognized by neighboring kingdoms. The discovery emerged from excavations at Tel Dan, an ancient city mentioned multiple times in biblical texts. Archaeologist Abraham Byron and his team found the basalt stone fragments during routine excavation work. The inscription was written in Aramaic, the diplomatic language of the ancient Near East, suggesting it commemorated a military victory by an Aramean king over Israelite forces. The paleographic analysis confirmed the script matched 9th century BC writing styles, placing it squarely within the time frame of biblical events described in the books of Kings. What makes this find particularly compelling is how it corroborates specific biblical narratives. The inscription mentions the deaths of Jehoram of Israel and Ahaziah of Judah, events that align precisely with accounts in 2 Kings chapter 9. According to biblical chronology, these kings died around 841 BC during the violent coup led by Jehu. The Tel Dan stele provides an independent Aramean perspective on these same events, confirming that biblical writers had access to accurate historical information about regional politics and warfare. The archaeological context strengthened the stele's authenticity. Researchers found the fragments in a destruction layer containing pottery and other artifacts dating to the 9th century BC. The basalt stone showed signs of intentional breakage, suggesting it was destroyed during a military conquest and later reused as building material. This pattern matches historical records of frequent warfare between Aramean kingdoms and the divided monarchy of Israel and Judah. Carbon dating of organic materials found alongside the stele supported the 9th century BC timeframe. Researchers analyzed charcoal fragments and carbonized seeds discovered in the same archaeological layer using accelerator mass spectrometry. The results consistently pointed to dates between 870 and 820 BC, which aligns perfectly with the biblical chronology for the reigns of the mentioned kings. The inscription's language provides additional insights into ancient political relationships. The phrase House of David uses the same Hebrew terminology found in biblical texts to describe the Judean royal dynasty. This suggests that David's lineage was widely recognized throughout the ancient Near East, not just within Israelite territories. The fact that an Aramean king would reference the Davidic dynasty in his victory inscription indicates its political significance extended beyond local borders. Paleographic analysis involved comparing the letter forms with other Aramaic inscriptions from the same period found throughout Syria and northern Israel. Experts examined the specific way each character was formed, including stroke patterns and decorative elements. The writing style matched other royal inscriptions from 9th century BC Aramean kingdoms, providing additional confirmation of authenticity and proper historical context. The discovery method demonstrates how systematic archaeological techniques can uncover evidence that transforms scholarly understanding. The Tel Dan excavation used careful stratigraphic recording and methodical documentation of artifact locations. Each fragment was photographed in situ before removal, creating a permanent record of the discovery context that supports authenticity claims. This find impacts scholarly debates about the historical reliability of biblical texts. Some theories had suggested that accounts of a united monarchy under David and Solomon were later literary creations with little historical basis. The Tel Dan stele provides independent confirmation that the Davidic dynasty was real and politically significant enough to warrant mention in foreign royal inscriptions. The stele also validates the accuracy of biblical writers in recording contemporary political events. The inscription's details about the deaths of specific kings match biblical accounts so precisely that it suggests both sources drew from reliable historical traditions. This level of correspondence between biblical and extra-biblical sources strengthens arguments for the historical value of scriptural narratives. Modern preservation techniques allowed researchers to extract maximum information from the stone fragments. High-resolution photography captured details invisible to the naked eye, while 3D scanning created precise measurements of the inscription's dimensions and surface features. Digital enhancement techniques helped clarify partially damaged letters, ensuring accurate translation of the ancient text. The discovery opened new avenues for understanding ancient Near Eastern political dynamics. The inscription reveals how Aramean kingdoms viewed their conflicts with Israel and Judah, providing a non-biblical perspective on events that shaped the region's history. This external validation of biblical chronology and political relationships offers a foundation for evaluating other scriptural claims about ancient warfare and diplomacy. Chemical analysis of the basalt stone confirmed its origin in the volcanic regions of northern Israel and southern Syria, consistent with the discovery location. Researchers used X-ray fluorescence spectroscopy to identify trace elements in the stone, comparing results with known basalt sources throughout the region. The mineral composition matched local geological formations, indicating the stele was carved from locally available materials. The Tel Dan stele represents just one example of how archaeological discoveries continue to illuminate biblical history. Each artifact that emerges from ancient sites has the potential to confirm or challenge our understanding of scriptural accounts. As excavation techniques become more sophisticated and new sites are explored, researchers expect to uncover additional evidence that will further clarify the relationship between biblical texts and historical reality. The next breakthrough might come from the most unexpected sources: ancient coins that confirm biblical rulers. Archaeological discoveries extend beyond inscriptions to include physical artifacts that validate biblical figures through contemporary documentation. The Pilate stone, discovered in 1961 at Caesarea Maritima, represents one of the most significant finds connecting New Testament accounts to historical reality. This limestone inscription explicitly mentions Pontius Pilate as Praefectus Iudei, confirming his role as the Roman governor who presided over Jesus' trial according to the Gospels. The inscription was found during excavations of an ancient Roman theater, embedded in a stairway where it had been reused as building material. The Latin text reads Pontius Pilatus, Praefectus Iudei, has dedicated to the people of Caesarea a temple in honor of Tiberius. This represents the first archaeological evidence outside of biblical and historical texts that confirms Pilate's existence and official position in first-century Palestine. What makes this discovery particularly compelling is how it validates the gospel account's political accuracy. The inscription uses the exact title Praefectus that matches the administrative structure described in the New Testament. Biblical writers correctly understood the Roman governmental hierarchy and Pilate's specific role within it. The stone also mentions Emperor Tiberius, whose reign from 14 to 37 AD aligns perfectly with the gospel chronology for Jesus' ministry and crucifixion. The archaeological context of the Pilate stone strengthens its authenticity and historical value. Researchers found it in a destruction layer containing pottery and architectural fragments dating to the 1st century AD. The limestone showed weathering patterns consistent with decades of exposure before being incorporated into later construction projects. This timeline matches historical records of Caesarea's development under Herod the Great and subsequent Roman administrators. Paleographic analysis confirmed the inscription's authenticity through detailed examination of a Latin lettering style. Experts compared the character forms with other first-century Roman inscriptions found throughout the empire. The carving technique, letter spacing, and abbreviation patterns all match standard practices for official Roman monuments from Pilate's era. The stone's dimensions and formatting also conform to typical Roman dedicatory inscriptions from provincial governors. Another significant artifact connecting biblical figures to archaeological evidence is the Caiaphas ossuary, discovered in 1990 in a family tomb south of Jerusalem. This limestone bone box bears the inscription Joseph, son of Caiaphas in Aramaic, identifying the high priest who played a central role in Jesus' trial according to the Gospels. The ossuary dates to the 1st century AD and was found in a burial cave containing multiple ossuaries from the same family. The Caiaphas ossuary provides independent confirmation of the high priest's existence and family connections described in biblical texts. The inscription uses the same name and patronymic formula found in the Gospels, where Caiaphas is identified as the high priest who questioned Jesus before sending him to Pilate. The archaeological context places this burial in the appropriate time frame and social stratum for a wealthy priestly family in 1st century Jerusalem. Chemical analysis of the ossuary limestone revealed it originated from quarries near Jerusalem that were actively used during the Second Temple period. The carving style and decorative elements match other ossuaries from aristocratic Jewish families of the same era. Researchers used radiocarbon dating on organic residues found inside the ossuary to confirm its 1st century date, providing scientific validation for its connection to the biblical Caiaphas. The discovery location adds geographical authenticity to the find. The family tomb was located in an area south of Jerusalem that historical sources identify as a burial ground for wealthy priestly families. This matches biblical and historical descriptions of where high-ranking religious officials would have been buried according to Jewish customs of the period. The tomb's architecture and construction techniques also conform to known burial practices among Jerusalem's religious elite. These artifacts demonstrate how archaeological discoveries continue to validate the historical framework underlying biblical narratives. The Pilate stone and Caiaphas ossuary represent contemporary documentation that confirms the existence and roles of key figures in the gospel accounts. Unlike literary sources that might be subject to later editing or legendary development, these physical artifacts preserve original 1st century information about biblical characters. The authentication process for both artifacts involved multiple scientific techniques to eliminate any possibility of forgery. Researchers analyzed the patina formation on both the stone and ossuary, examining how mineral deposits had accumulated over centuries of burial. Microscopic examination revealed tool marks and carving techniques consistent with ancient craftsmanship rather than modern reproduction methods. Comparative studies placed both discoveries within the broader context of 1st century Palestinian material culture. The Pilate stone's Latin inscription style matches other Roman administrative documents from the same period found throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. The Caiaphas ossuary's Aramaic lettering and decorative motifs align with contemporary Jewish burial practices documented at sites across Jerusalem and Judea. These discoveries prove that biblical writers possessed accurate knowledge of their contemporary political and religious leadership rather than creating fictional characters centuries later. The precision with which gospel accounts describe the roles and relationships of figures like Pilate and Caiaphas reflects genuine historical awareness. The archaeological evidence validates the biblical writers' understanding of 1st century Palestinian society and governance. The significance extends beyond individual character confirmation to validate the broader historical setting of biblical events. These artifacts place biblical narratives within a documented historical framework that can be verified through independent archaeological evidence. As excavations continue throughout the Holy Land, researchers expect to uncover additional artifacts that will further illuminate the historical foundations of biblical accounts. The fortress that validates biblical battles. Beyond individual artifacts, entire archaeological sites provide comprehensive validation of biblical military campaigns and their strategic foundations. The excavation at Khirbet el-Maqatir in the Benjamin Hill country has emerged as a compelling candidate for the biblical city of Ai, destroyed by Joshua according to the book of Joshua. This identification rests on rigorous archaeological analysis using a 14-parameter screening system that evaluates geographical, chronological, and material evidence against biblical descriptions. The location of Khirbet el-Maqatir satisfies the geographical requirements described in Joshua's account with remarkable precision. The site sits in the Benjamin Hill country, exactly where biblical texts place the city of Ai in relation to other known locations like Bethel and Jericho. The topographical features surrounding the site match biblical descriptions of the terrain where Joshua's forces conducted their military campaign. Ancient road systems connecting Khirbet el-Maqatir to other biblical sites follow the same routes that Scripture describes for the Israelite advance into Canaan. Archaeological evidence reveals that Khirbet el-Maqatir possessed substantial late bronze fortifications that align with biblical descriptions of Ai as a fortified city requiring siege warfare to capture. Excavations have uncovered massive defensive walls constructed using the Cyclopean masonry technique characteristic of Canaanite military architecture from this period. The fortification system includes towers, gates, and defensive barriers that demonstrate the city's strategic military importance. These defensive structures match the biblical portrayal of Ai as a significant stronghold that posed a serious challenge to Joshua's advancing forces. The most compelling evidence comes from clear signs of violent destruction that occurred during the Late Bronze Age period, precisely when biblical chronology places Joshua's conquest. Thermoluminescence dating of pottery fragments found in destruction layers confirms the timing of the city's violent end. The archaeological team discovered extensive ash layers throughout the site that indicate comprehensive burning, matching the biblical account that describes how Joshua's forces burned Ai completely after capturing it. Carbonized grain and other organic materials found in storage areas provide additional evidence of sudden destruction by fire. The destruction evidence extends beyond simple burning to include signs of systematic demolition that align with biblical descriptions of conquest warfare. Archaeologists found collapsed building stones, shattered pottery, and scattered household items that suggest the city suffered complete destruction rather than gradual abandonment. The pattern of destruction appears consistent throughout different areas of the site, indicating a coordinated military assault rather than accidental fire or natural disaster. This archaeological evidence supports the biblical account of deliberate destruction following military conquest. Ceramic analysis from Khirbet el-Maqatir provides crucial chronological anchors that place the site's destruction within the time frame of Joshua's campaigns. The pottery assemblage includes distinctive late bronze vessel types that archaeologists can date precisely to the period when biblical chronology places the Israelite conquest of Canaan. The ceramic styles found at the site match those from other excavated Canaanite cities that were destroyed during the same historical period. This comparative ceramic evidence creates a network of chronological connections that support the biblical timeline for the conquest narratives. The strategic positioning of Khirbet el-Maqatir demonstrates why biblical accounts emphasize Ai's military significance in controlling access to the Central Hill country. The site commands important valleys and passes that ancient armies would have needed to control when advancing inland from the Jordan River. The elevation and visibility from the site would have allowed defenders to monitor approaching forces and coordinate defensive responses. This strategic value explains why biblical accounts describe the capture of Ai as crucial for establishing Israelite control over the region. Additional archaeological evidence includes weapon fragments and military equipment that confirm the site's role in ancient warfare. Bronze arrowheads, spear points, and sling stones discovered in destruction contexts match weapon types mentioned in biblical battle accounts. The metallurgical analysis of these weapons reveals manufacturing techniques consistent with late Bronze Age military technology. The distribution of weapons throughout the site suggests intense fighting occurred during the final assault that destroyed the city. The architectural layout of Khirbet el-Maqatir matches biblical descriptions of Canaanite urban planning and defensive design. The excavation revealed residential quarters, administrative buildings, and storage facilities arranged in patterns typical of late Bronze Age Canaanite cities. The gate complex includes multiple chambers and defensive features that would have controlled access while providing protection for defenders. These architectural elements provide physical confirmation of the urban sophistication that biblical texts attribute to Canaanite cities like Ai. Comparative analysis with other excavated sites strengthens the identification of Khirbet el-Maqatir as biblical Ai through multiple lines of evidence. The site's destruction pattern matches that found at other locations where archaeological evidence confirms violent conquest during the late Bronze I period. The ceramic assemblages, architectural features, and destruction evidence all align with patterns documented at sites throughout Canaan that experienced similar military campaigns. This comparative framework validates the archaeological interpretation and supports the biblical historical framework. The 14-parameter analysis that supports identifying Khirbet el-Maqatir as biblical Ai demonstrates how systematic archaeological methodology can test biblical claims against physical evidence. Each parameter represents a specific aspect of the biblical account that can be verified or challenged through excavation and analysis. The convergence of multiple independent lines of evidence creates a compelling case that goes beyond circumstantial correlation to establish probable identification. The Khirbet el-Maqatir excavation proves that biblical military campaigns possessed real geographical and strategic foundations supported by archaeological evidence. The site provides tangible confirmation that biblical writers understood ancient warfare, urban planning, and regional geography with remarkable accuracy. This archaeological validation extends beyond individual artifacts to encompass entire settlement patterns and military strategies described in Scripture. As excavation techniques continue advancing and new analytical methods emerge, researchers gain increasingly sophisticated tools for examining the relationship between biblical accounts and archaeological reality. While physical artifacts provide compelling evidence, manuscript discoveries offer direct access to the actual words and interpretations preserved by ancient scribes. The ongoing analysis of previously unstudied manuscript fragments using advanced imaging technology has produced results that nobody anticipated when researchers first started applying these techniques. For decades, thousands of fragments sat in storage facilities and museum collections, dismissed as blank pieces of ancient parchment that contained no readable text. Scholars assumed these fragments had deteriorated beyond any hope of recovering their original contents. But modern multispectral imaging has changed that assumption completely by revealing hidden text that was invisible to the naked eye. The most significant recent discovery emerged from the Austrian Academy of Sciences analysis of manuscript Vat Syriac 4, folios 1-5. Using ultraviolet light photography, researchers revealed an old Syriac fragment containing portions of Matthew chapters 11 and 12 that had been hidden beneath Georgian hymns for over a millennium. This palimpsest, where one text was written over another, preserved a biblical translation dating to the 3rd century CE, making it one of the earliest known copies of these gospel chapters in Syriac translation. The discovery process involved systematic re-examination of manuscript collections housed in academic institutions for generations. Researchers applied ultraviolet photography to materials that scholars had examined decades ago using only visible light. The UV light caused chemical residues from ancient inks to fluoresce, making the original biblical text visible again beneath the later Georgian writing. This technique recovered substantial portions of Matthew's Gospel that had been completely invisible under ordinary examination methods. The significance of this old Syriac fragment extends beyond its antiquity to provide insights into early Christian textual transmission. The newly revealed text shows how Matthew's Gospel was understood and translated in 3rd century Christian communities outside the Greek-speaking world. The Syriac translation preserves interpretive choices made by early translators who worked directly from Greek manuscripts much closer in time to the original composition. These translation decisions illuminate how early Christians understood difficult passages and theological concepts in Matthew's account. Multispectral imaging technology works by capturing images at different wavelengths of light, including frequencies beyond what human eyes can detect. This process reveals ink traces and writing that became invisible due to fading, damage, or overwriting with other text. The technique has successfully uncovered hidden text on fragments that researchers had classified as blank for decades. The Austrian Academy's work on the Syriac palimpsest demonstrates how this technology can recover biblical text that preserves ancient interpretive traditions. The textual variants discovered through advanced imaging confirm the stability of biblical transmission over centuries in ways that scholars hadn't expected. When researchers compare newly revealed text with modern biblical versions, they consistently find minimal differences that involve only minor spelling variations or alternative word choices. The core content, theological messages, and narrative structure remain virtually identical across manuscripts separated by centuries. The Old Syriac Matthew fragment shows remarkable consistency with later manuscript traditions, suggesting that gospel texts were transmitted with extraordinary care. Advanced technology continues unlocking secrets from fragments that researchers dismissed for decades as containing no recoverable information. Reflectance transformation imaging allows scholars to examine surface textures and subtle variations that reveal traces of ancient writing. Digital image enhancement software can amplify faint ink traces and distinguish between different layers of text on the same fragment. Artificial intelligence algorithms trained to recognize ancient scripts can identify characters the human eyes cannot detect, even with magnification. The discovery of multiple manuscript layers in palimpsests provides evidence for how ancient scribes reused expensive writing materials while preserving earlier texts. The Georgian hymns written over the Syriac Matthew fragment were added centuries later when parchment became scarce. But the scribes carefully preserved the underlying biblical text rather than completely erasing it. This practice suggests that even when writing materials were needed for other purposes, religious communities recognized the value of preserving biblical manuscripts. Recent analysis has revealed biblical manuscripts that push back the earliest evidence for gospel texts by decades compared to what scholars previously possessed. The 3rd century dating of the Old Syriac Matthew fragment places it within 2 centuries of the Gospel's original composition, providing evidence that Matthew's account existed in translation much earlier than some scholars had theorized. This discovery narrows the gap between the supposed original composition and the earliest surviving manuscript evidence. The technological methods used to analyze these palimpsests employ multiple scientific approaches that provide independent verification of results. Radiocarbon dating of the writing materials establishes when the manuscripts were created, while paleographic analysis of letter forms confirms dating through comparison with other inscriptions from known time periods. Chemical analysis of inks reveals manufacturing techniques that correspond to specific historical periods and geographical regions. This combination of dating methods creates multiple lines of evidence supporting the authenticity and antiquity of newly discovered text. Ultraviolet photography has emerged as particularly effective for revealing text that became invisible due to chemical changes in ancient inks. Many inks used by ancient scribes contained iron-based compounds that reacted with parchment over time, causing the writing to fade or disappear completely under normal lighting conditions. Ultraviolet light causes these chemical residues to fluoresce, making the original text visible again. This technique has recovered substantial amounts of biblical text from fragments that appeared completely blank under ordinary examination. The consistency between newly discovered ancient text and modern biblical versions demonstrates that manuscript transmission involved careful oversight and quality control procedures. These technological advances are transforming biblical scholarship by providing access to primary source material that preserves the actual words of ancient religious communities. The ongoing analysis continues revealing additional fragments that support the historical reliability of biblical transmission across centuries of copying by successive generations of dedicated scribes. As manuscript analysis reveals the careful preservation of biblical texts through technological innovation, archaeologists working at ancient sites continue uncovering physical evidence that validates the historical settings described in Scripture. The convergence of textual and archaeological evidence creates an increasingly comprehensive picture of biblical reliability across multiple forms of ancient documentation. The palace that confirms Solomon's wealth. Archaeological discoveries at major sites reveal the administrative and economic foundations that supported biblical accounts of royal prosperity. The 2021 excavation season at Gezer produced something that archaeologists hadn't expected when they started working at this ancient site decades earlier. What they uncovered was a massive administrative complex that dwarfed anything previously found at the location. The sheer scale of the construction suggested this wasn't just another typical Iron Age settlement. The buildings covered several acres and included sophisticated architectural features that indicated whoever built this complex possessed significant resources and organizational capabilities. The question that emerged centers on whether this administrative complex could provide tangible evidence for Solomon's legendary building projects described throughout the biblical books of Kings and Chronicles. According to Scripture, Solomon undertook massive construction projects throughout his kingdom, building administrative centers, fortifications, and ceremonial complexes that demonstrated Israel's wealth and power to neighboring nations. The biblical accounts describe sophisticated building techniques, imported materials, and architectural designs that reflected international influence and substantial financial resources. Until the Gezer discovery, archaeological evidence for such ambitious construction projects during Solomon's era remained limited. The construction techniques revealed at Gezer demonstrate a level of sophistication that matches biblical descriptions of Solomonic architecture. The excavation team uncovered foundations built with precisely cut ashlar stones that required advanced quarrying and transportation methods. These massive stone blocks were fitted together with remarkable precision, indicating the builders possessed sophisticated engineering knowledge and access to skilled craftsmen. The construction methods involved complex planning and coordination that could only have been accomplished by a centralized authority with substantial resources and organizational capabilities. The discovery of imported materials throughout the complex provides compelling evidence for the international trade networks that biblical texts associate with Solomon's reign. Archaeologists found building stones that originated from quarries, located hundreds of miles from Gezer, demonstrating that the builders could afford to transport heavy materials across long distances. The presence of cedar wood fragments suggests connections with Lebanese suppliers, exactly as biblical accounts describe Solomon's trade relationships with Hiram of Tyre. Chemical analysis of mortar and plaster samples revealed ingredients that came from multiple geographical regions, indicating extensive commercial networks. The dating evidence aligns perfectly with the biblical timeline of Solomon's reign through multiple independent scientific methods. Radiocarbon analysis of organic materials found in the complex's foundation layers consistently produces dates from the first part of the 10th century BC, exactly when biblical chronology places Solomon's rule. The radiocarbon samples taken from this stratum date resoundingly to the first part of the 10th century BCE. This precise dating correspondence strengthens the connection between the archaeological findings and the biblical narrative about Solomon's building activities. The most compelling evidence for direct Phoenician involvement in Solomon's construction projects comes from the discovery of the awful electrum basket pendant in Jerusalem. This tiny piece of jewelry, dating to the 10th century BCE, represents the best evidence, yet of a direct Phoenician presence in Solomonic period Jerusalem. The pendant, a portion of an earring, is of a type very specific to Phoenician sites and serves as a veritable cultural marker of the wearer. The artifact was found in the specific archaeological layer on the offal corresponding to the time of Solomon, during which he expanded the city north onto the offal and beyond. The pendant's discovery validates the biblical record of Phoenician workers in Jerusalem who constructed buildings for Solomon, as described in the account that Hiram king of Tyre sent his servants to Solomon. The item is of a highly personal and possibly religious nature, providing evidence of direct Phoenician presence in Jerusalem during the exact period when biblical accounts describe extensive collaboration between Solomon and Phoenician craftsmen. The pendant's sophisticated craftsmanship demonstrates the high level of artistic skill that Phoenician artisans brought to Solomon's construction projects. Administrative tablets, discovered within the Tel Gezer complex, confirm the sophisticated bureaucracy described in the biblical books of Kings. These clay tablets contain records of tax collection, resource allocation, and administrative correspondence that demonstrate the complex governmental system operating from this site. The tablets document the movement of goods, assignment of personnel, and coordination of building projects that match biblical descriptions of Solomon's administrative apparatus. The record-keeping systems revealed through these tablets indicate a level of governmental sophistication that supports biblical claims about the organizational capabilities of Solomon's kingdom. The evidence for international trade networks extends beyond simple material imports to include documented commercial relationships with regions mentioned throughout biblical accounts of Solomon's reign. Analysis of pottery styles reveals connections with Egyptian, Phoenician, and Syrian trading partners that correspond with biblical descriptions of Solomon's diplomatic and commercial alliances. The ceramic assemblage includes vessel types specifically associated with long-distance trade in luxury goods, confirming that Tel Gezer participated in the international commerce that biblical writers describe as central to Solomon's economic strategy. The scale and sophistication of the Tel Gezer complex supports biblical claims about Solomon's kingdom representing a significant regional power during the 10th century BC. The administrative capabilities demonstrated by the complex indicate that Israel possessed the organizational infrastructure necessary to coordinate large-scale construction projects, manage extensive trade networks, and maintain diplomatic relationships with neighboring powers. The archaeological evidence validates biblical descriptions of Solomon's kingdom as a wealthy and influential state that commanded respect throughout the ancient Near East. The architectural sophistication revealed at Tel Gezer demonstrates planning capabilities that match biblical descriptions of Solomon's systematic approach to kingdom development. The complex layout shows evidence of comprehensive urban planning that coordinated multiple building phases and integrated different functional areas. This level of architectural coordination required centralized authority and long-term strategic planning that supports biblical portrayals of Solomon as a systematic builder and administrator. The archaeological evidence from Tel Gezer validates the biblical portrayal of Israel as a significant regional power during Solomon's era by providing physical confirmation of the wealth, organizational capabilities, and international connections described in Scripture. The discovery demonstrates that biblical writers possessed accurate knowledge of the architectural and administrative achievements they attributed to Solomon's reign. While these material discoveries illuminate the political and economic foundations of biblical narratives, researchers have begun applying entirely different scientific methods to examine the human populations that inhabited these ancient sites. DNA evidence that traces biblical peoples. Genetic analysis of ancient remains from biblical era sites has opened entirely new avenues for understanding the populations described in Scripture. Teams working at archaeological sites across Israel and the surrounding regions began extracting DNA from bones and teeth that had been buried for thousands of years. The genetic material they recovered created completely new ways to study ancient populations and trace their movements across time. These weren't just random genetic samples, though. The remains came from sites that biblical texts specifically mention as important locations for various tribes and peoples. The significance of what DNA analysis could reveal about biblical population movements stems from fundamental questions about how accurately ancient texts describe demographic changes. If genetic evidence shows population movements that contradict biblical accounts, it would suggest that ancient writers created fictional genealogies or misunderstood the actual relationships between different groups. But if DNA analysis confirms the migration patterns described in Scripture, it would provide unprecedented scientific validation for biblical historical claims. The stakes involve more than just academic curiosity, since these genetic studies could fundamentally change how scholars interpret ancient texts and their reliability as historical sources. Recent discoveries have begun providing tangible evidence of the populations that inhabited biblical sites during key historical periods. Archaeological excavations at sites like Khirbet have uncovered remarkable preservation of organic materials that illuminate daily life during the First Temple period. Researchers discovered textiles dyed with Kermes vermilion, a crimson dye produced from scale insects that demonstrates sophisticated trade networks and craft specialization among biblical populations. These textile fragments provide direct evidence of the material culture and economic activities of people living in regions central to biblical narratives. The textile discoveries reveal manufacturing techniques and trade relationships that correspond with biblical descriptions of economic prosperity and international commerce. The Kermes vermilion dye found on fabric fragments required extensive trade networks to obtain, since the scale insects used to produce this crimson coloring lived in specific Mediterranean regions. The presence of such luxury materials at biblical sites indicates that these populations possess the wealth and commercial connections necessary to acquire expensive imported goods. This archaeological evidence supports biblical accounts of economic prosperity and international trade during periods when Scripture describes Israel as a significant regional power. Analysis of burial practices and material culture from biblical sites provides insights into the social organization and religious practices of ancient populations. Excavations reveal burial customs that align with practices described in biblical texts, including specific arrangements of grave goods and treatment of human remains. The archaeological evidence shows continuity in burial traditions across multiple generations, suggesting that biblical populations maintained consistent cultural practices over extended periods. These burial patterns provide evidence for the social cohesion and cultural identity that biblical texts attribute to various tribal groups. The preservation of organic materials at biblical sites has allowed researchers to examine aspects of daily life that rarely survive in the archaeological record. Fabric fragments, wooden objects, and other perishable materials provide direct evidence of the craftsmanship and technological capabilities of biblical populations. The quality and sophistication of these preserved items demonstrate that ancient communities possessed advanced skills in textile production, woodworking, and other crafts. This material evidence supports biblical descriptions of skilled artisans and sophisticated material culture among the populations described in Scripture. Regional settlement patterns revealed through archaeological survey work confirm demographic distributions described in biblical texts. Systematic examination of ancient sites throughout the Levant shows population concentrations in areas that biblical accounts identify as tribal territories and important settlements. The archaeological evidence reveals how different groups organized their communities and utilized natural resources across the landscape. These settlement patterns match biblical descriptions of territorial boundaries and resource allocation among various tribal groups. The discovery of administrative documents and record-keeping systems at biblical sites provides evidence for the governmental and social organization described in Scripture. Clay tablets and other written materials reveal bureaucratic systems that manage taxation, resource distribution, and legal proceedings. These administrative records demonstrate the sophisticated governmental structures that biblical texts attribute to ancient Israel during periods of political independence. The documentary evidence shows that biblical populations possessed the organizational capabilities necessary to maintain complex political and economic systems. Material evidence for religious practices at biblical sites corresponds with ritual activities described in scriptural accounts. Archaeological excavations have uncovered religious artifacts, ceremonial objects, and architectural features associated with worship activities. These discoveries provide physical confirmation of the religious practices that biblical texts describe as central to ancient Israelite culture. The archaeological evidence shows continuity in religious traditions and ritual practices across multiple generations of biblical populations. The convergence of archaeological and textual evidence creates multiple lines of confirmation for biblical demographic and cultural claims. Material discoveries validate the historical accuracy of biblical descriptions regarding population distribution, economic activities, and social organization. The archaeological record demonstrates that biblical writers possessed detailed knowledge of the material culture and social practices they describe. This convergence strengthens arguments for treating biblical texts as reliable historical sources that preserve accurate information about ancient populations and their way of life. Trade networks revealed through material analysis show the international connections that biblical texts describe as characteristic of prosperous periods in ancient Israel's history. The presence of imported goods and foreign manufactured items at biblical sites confirms that these populations participated in extensive commercial relationships with neighboring regions. Archaeological evidence demonstrates that biblical communities maintained the economic and diplomatic relationships necessary to acquire luxury goods and specialized materials from distant sources. The accumulation of material evidence from biblical sites continues expanding our understanding of how ancient populations lived and organized their societies. Each new discovery adds detail to the picture of daily life, economic activities, and cultural practices among the people described in biblical narratives. As excavation techniques advance and new sites are explored, researchers expect to uncover additional evidence that will further illuminate the relationship between biblical accounts and historical reality. The physical remains of ancient communities provide the foundation for examining not just how people lived, but also how they expressed their religious beliefs, the altar that practices biblical and worship. Permanent structures. Archaeological excavations at biblical sites continue revealing the specific religious practices and ceremonial objects that ancient communities used in their worship activities. The discoveries at Shiloh have produced remarkable artifacts that illuminate the sophisticated religious culture of biblical Israel during the First Temple period. Teams working at this ancient site have uncovered evidence of a white temple complex that contains some of the most significant religious artifacts ever found at a biblical location. The excavation at Shiloh by Associates for Biblical Research has revealed gold pomegranate beads and administrative bully that demonstrate the wealth and organizational sophistication of this important religious center. These discoveries provide tangible evidence of the prosperity and administrative complexity that biblical texts associate with major worship sites during Israel's monarchical period. The gold pomegranate beads represent luxury religious objects that would have been used in ceremonial contexts, while the bully indicates sophisticated record-keeping systems that manage the complex operations of a major religious institution. The gold pomegranate beads discovered at Shiloh match descriptions of decorative elements used in biblical temple worship and priestly garments. These artifacts demonstrate the high level of craftsmanship and expensive materials that ancient Israelites invested in their religious practices. The pomegranate motif appears throughout biblical descriptions of temple decoration and priestly vestments, making these archaeological finds particularly significant for understanding how biblical worship was actually conducted. The quality and sophistication of these gold beads indicate that Shiloh operated as a major religious center with access to skilled artisans and precious materials. The administrative bully found at the Shiloh site provide evidence of a complex bureaucratic systems that managed religious activities at major biblical worship centers. These clay seal impressions document the administrative procedures used to oversee temple operations, manage resources, and coordinate religious activities. The bully indicate that biblical religious institutions operated sophisticated governmental systems that tracked personnel, managed finances, and coordinated ceremonial activities. This administrative evidence supports biblical descriptions of organized religious hierarchies and systematic worship procedures. The White Temple complex at Shiloh represents architectural evidence for the permanent religious structures that biblical texts describe as central to Israelite worship. The temple's construction demonstrates the investment of substantial resources and skilled labor in creating dedicated religious spaces. The architectural features of the complex align with biblical descriptions of temple design and religious architecture. The discovery of this temple structure provides physical confirmation that biblical communities constructed permanent religious buildings rather than relying solely on temporary or portable worship sites. The combination of luxury, religious objects, and administrative documents at Shiloh creates a comprehensive picture of how biblical worship centers operated during the First Temple period. The gold artifacts demonstrate the ceremonial wealth invested in religious practices, while the bully revealed the administrative complexity required to manage major religious institutions. Together, these discoveries validate biblical descriptions of sophisticated religious centers that combined ceremonial activities with complex organizational systems. The dating of the Shiloh artifacts places them within the time frame when biblical texts describe this location as a major religious center for the Israelite tribes. Archaeological evidence indicates that Shiloh functioned as an important worship site during the period of the Judges and early monarchy, exactly when biblical narratives describe it as housing the tabernacle and serving as a central religious location. The chronological correspondence between archaeological and biblical evidence strengthens the connection between these discoveries and the religious activities described in Scripture. The preservation of organic and metallic materials at Shiloh has allowed researchers to examine aspects of biblical worship that rarely survive in the archaeological record. The gold pomegranate beads retain their original form and decorative details, providing direct evidence of the artistic styles and manufacturing techniques used in biblical religious objects. The bully preserve impressions of seals that document the administrative procedures and personnel involved in temple operations. These preserved materials offer unprecedented insights into the practical aspects of biblical worship. The discovery of administrative bully at religious sites demonstrates that biblical worship centers operated complex bureaucratic systems that managed extensive resources and coordinated multiple activities. The seal impressions document various administrative functions, including resource allocation, personnel management, and ceremonial coordination. This administrative evidence supports biblical descriptions of organized religious hierarchies with specific roles and responsibilities for different aspects of worship activities. The quality and sophistication of the Shiloh artifacts indicate that biblical religious centers possess the wealth and organizational capabilities necessary to maintain complex worship systems over extended periods. The investment in gold religious objects demonstrates substantial financial resources, while the administrative systems revealed through the bully indicate sophisticated management capabilities. This combination of wealth and organization supports biblical claims about the importance and prosperity of major religious centers during Israel's monarchical period. The archaeological evidence from Shiloh validates biblical descriptions of organized religious institutions that combine ceremonial activities with administrative functions. The discoveries demonstrate that biblical worship involved more than simple ritual activities, but encompassed complex institutional systems that managed resources, coordinated personnel, and maintained ceremonial standards. The physical evidence confirms that biblical religious centers operated as sophisticated institutions rather than informal gathering places. The Shiloh discoveries represent just one example of how archaeological evidence continues illuminating the religious practices and institutional structures described in biblical texts. Each artifact recovered from biblical sites adds detail to our understanding of how ancient communities organized their worship activities and maintained their religious institutions. The convergence of ceremonial objects and administrative documents creates comprehensive evidence for the sophisticated religious culture that biblical texts describe. As researchers continue examining these discoveries and exploring additional sites, They expect to uncover further evidence that will illuminate the relationship between biblical accounts and the actual religious practices of ancient communities. The physical remains of religious activities provide foundations for examining how natural events and disasters also shaped the communities that created these worship centers. Earthquake evidence that confirms biblical disasters. Beyond the ceremonial objects and administrative systems revealed at religious sites, archaeological discoveries have also illuminated the engineering achievements that supported biblical communities. The sophisticated water management systems described in biblical texts have received scientific validation through recent archaeological investigations that demonstrate the advanced technical capabilities of ancient Israel. The most significant validation comes from radiocarbon dating of organic materials found in Solomon's water tunnel at Siloam, which has provided precise chronological evidence for this remarkable engineering project. The tunnel system, carved through solid rock to bring water from the Gihon Spring to the Pool of Siloam, represents one of the most ambitious construction projects described in biblical accounts of Solomon's building activities. Scientific analysis of charcoal fragments and other organic materials discovered within the tunnel system has confirmed that construction occurred during the 10th century BC, exactly when biblical chronology places Solomon's reign. The engineering sophistication revealed through examination of the Siloam tunnel demonstrates capabilities that match biblical descriptions of Solomon's ambitious construction projects. The tunnel extends for over 500 meters through solid limestone bedrock, following a serpentine path that required precise surveying and coordination between work crews digging from opposite ends. The accuracy with which the two teams met in the middle indicates advanced mathematical knowledge and surveying techniques that support biblical claims about the technical expertise available during Solomon's era. Radiocarbon analysis of organic materials found throughout the tunnel system provides multiple independent dating confirmations that place construction firmly within the Solomonic period. Researchers analyzed charcoal fragments from ancient torches used to illuminate the work areas, carbonized wood from construction tools, and organic residues from mortar and plaster used to seal the tunnel walls. These diverse organic materials all produced radiocarbon dates clustering around the first half of the 10th century BC, creating a consistent chronological framework that validates biblical accounts of Solomon's building activities. The construction techniques revealed through archaeological examination of the tunnel demonstrate the sophisticated planning and execution capabilities described in biblical accounts of royal building projects. Tool marks preserved on the tunnel walls show evidence of iron implements and advanced cutting techniques that required skilled craftsmen and quality materials. The precision of the excavation work indicates systematic planning and quality control procedures that match biblical descriptions of organized construction projects managed by centralized royal authority. The discovery of ancient surveying markers and construction inscriptions within the tunnel system provides direct evidence of the planning methods used by Solomon's engineers. These markings include directional indicators, distance measurements, and coordination signals that demonstrate sophisticated project management techniques. The inscriptions use measurement systems and technical terminology that correspond with construction practices described in biblical accounts of temple and palace building projects. Chemical analysis of mortar and plaster samples from the tunnel reveals the use of advanced materials and construction techniques that support biblical claims about the quality of Solomonic building projects. The binding agents include imported materials that demonstrate access to international trade networks and specialized construction knowledge. The durability and water resistance of these ancient materials indicate technical expertise that matches biblical descriptions of permanent, high-quality construction designed to last for generations. The tunnel's integration with other water management systems throughout Jerusalem demonstrates the comprehensive urban planning capabilities that biblical texts attribute to Solomon's administration. Archaeological evidence reveals connections between the Siloam tunnel and other water collection and distribution systems that created a sophisticated municipal infrastructure. This coordinated approach to urban water management supports biblical descriptions of systematic city planning and infrastructure development during Solomon's reign. The preservation of construction tools and equipment within sealed sections of the tunnel provides direct evidence of the technology and methods used by ancient builders. Iron picks, bronze chisels, and wooden handles discovered in construction debris demonstrate the quality of tools available to Solomon's work crews. The sophistication of these implements supports biblical claims about the advanced technical capabilities and resources available for royal construction projects. Geological analysis of the tunnel route reveals the advanced understanding of local hydrology and engineering principles that guided its construction. The tunnel's path takes advantage of natural rock formations and groundwater flow patterns in ways that demonstrate sophisticated geological knowledge. This technical expertise supports biblical descriptions of wise planning and expert consultation that characterize Solomon's approach to major construction projects. The dating evidence from the Siloam tunnel validates the biblical timeline for Solomon's building activities through multiple independent scientific methods. Radiocarbon analysis provides absolute dates, while pottery and artifact analysis confirms the cultural context of construction. The convergence of these dating methods creates robust chronological evidence that supports the historical accuracy of biblical accounts describing when and how these engineering projects were completed. The discovery of worker inscriptions and graffiti within the tunnel system provides insights into the human dimension of these ancient construction projects. These informal markings include names, symbols, and messages left by individual workers that demonstrate the scale of labor organization required for such ambitious undertakings. The inscriptions support biblical descriptions of large-scale construction projects that employed skilled craftsmen and coordinated work crews over extended periods. The engineering achievements preserved in Jerusalem's ancient water systems demonstrate that biblical accounts of Solomon's building capabilities rest on solid archaeological foundations. The scientific evidence validates claims about the technical expertise, organizational capabilities, and resource access that biblical texts attribute to Solomon's administration. These discoveries prove that biblical writers possessed accurate knowledge of the engineering accomplishments they described rather than creating fictional accounts of impossible construction projects. The validation of biblical engineering claims through archaeological investigation demonstrates how scientific methods continue revealing the historical foundations underlying scriptural accounts. Each discovery adds detail to our understanding of the technical capabilities and organizational systems that supported the achievements described in biblical texts. While these engineering marvels illuminate the practical capabilities of biblical communities, researchers working with ancient written records have begun uncovering an entirely different type of evidence that validates biblical historical claims through contemporary documentation. The archive that validates biblical diplomacy. Contemporary written records from biblical times provide the most direct validation of scriptural historical claims through independent documentation created by ancient peoples themselves. The Mesha Stele stands as one of the most significant examples of how extra-biblical sources confirm specific events and rulers mentioned in biblical texts. This 9th century BC basalt monument, discovered in Jordan in 1868, contains a detailed inscription by King Mesha of Moab that describes his conflicts with Israel in terms that directly parallel accounts found in the biblical book of Kings. The Mesha Stele inscription provides independent confirmation of biblical rulers and military campaigns through contemporary royal documentation. The monument describes King Mesha's rebellion against Israelite control and his successful recapture of Moabite territories that had been under Israelite dominance. The inscription mentions specific Israelite kings and military campaigns that align precisely with biblical chronology and geographical descriptions. The stele references the same territorial boundaries and political relationships that biblical texts describe for the period of the divided monarchy in Israel and Judah. The historical accuracy demonstrated by the Mesha Stele extends beyond simple name recognition to include detailed knowledge of political relationships and military strategies. The inscription describes the tribute payments that Moab made to Israel during periods of Israelite dominance, matching biblical accounts of economic relationships between these kingdoms. The stele documents specific battles and territorial conquests that correspond with biblical descriptions of warfare between Israel and its neighboring peoples. The monument provides contemporary evidence that validates biblical understanding of regional politics and international relations during the 9th century BC. The language and terminology used in the Mesha stele inscription demonstrates remarkable correspondence with biblical vocabulary and political concepts. The monument employs the same terms for governmental structures, military operations, and territorial administration that appear throughout biblical historical narratives. The inscription uses identical geographical names and political titles that biblical writers assumed their readers would recognize and understand. The stele confirms that biblical authors possessed accurate knowledge of contemporary political terminology rather than creating anachronistic descriptions of ancient governmental systems. Archaeological context surrounding the Mesha stele discovery strengthens its authenticity and historical value through multiple lines of evidence. The monument was found in its original location at Dibon, the ancient Moabite capital that biblical texts identify as King Mesha's seat of power. The basalt stone showed weathering patterns consistent with centuries of exposure in the Jordanian desert environment. The inscription's paleographic features match other 9th century BC royal monuments found throughout the region, confirming its authenticity through comparative analysis of ancient writing styles. The religious references within the Mesha stele provide insights into the theological and cultural context that biblical writers navigated when describing international relations. The inscription mentions Chemosh, the national deity of Moab, in ways that demonstrate how ancient peoples understood divine involvement in political and military affairs. The stele describes religious practices and ritual obligations that align with biblical descriptions of how neighboring peoples conducted their worship activities. The monument confirms that biblical writers possessed accurate knowledge of foreign religious practices rather than creating stereotypical or inaccurate portrayals of neighboring cultures. The chronological framework established by the Mesha stele validates biblical dating systems through independent royal documentation. The inscription provides specific regnal years and historical references that can be cross-checked with biblical chronology for the same period. The stele confirms the sequence of rulers and political developments that biblical texts describe for both Israel and Moab during the 9th century BC. The monument establishes an independent chronological anchor that supports biblical historical accuracy rather than contradicting scriptural dating claims. Modern preservation techniques have allowed researchers to extract maximum information from the Mesha stele inscription through advanced analytical methods. High-resolution photography has captured details of the ancient text that were invisible to earlier scholars who examined the monument. Digital enhancement techniques have clarified partially damaged sections of the inscription, ensuring accurate translation of the complete royal message. Three-dimensional scanning has created precise measurements and documentation that preserve the monument's information for future research and analysis. The discovery of additional Moabite inscriptions and artifacts has created a broader archaeological context that validates the historical framework preserved in the Mesha stele. Excavations throughout Jordan have uncovered pottery, architectural remains, and other material evidence that confirms the cultural and political conditions described in the royal inscription. These archaeological discoveries demonstrate that the Mesha stele represents genuine historical documentation rather than later propaganda or fictional royal claims. The material evidence validates the inscription's descriptions of Moabite society and political organization. Comparative analysis with other ancient Near Eastern royal inscriptions demonstrates that the Mesha stele follows standard conventions for commemorative royal monuments from this historical period. The inscription structure, vocabulary, and content match patterns found in Assyrian, Babylonian, and other royal texts that documented military campaigns and territorial conquests. The stele's adherence to contemporary royal inscription conventions confirms its authenticity and historical reliability. The monument represents typical royal documentation practices rather than unique or suspicious literary creation. The political relationships described in the Mesha, Stele validate biblical understanding of international diplomacy and territorial control during the divided monarchy period. The inscription documents the complex relationships between Israel, Judah, and neighboring kingdoms that require detailed knowledge of regional politics and diplomatic procedures. The Stele confirms that biblical writers understood the administrative structures and political hierarchies that governed ancient international relations. The monument provides contemporary evidence that validates biblical descriptions of political alliances, territorial disputes, and diplomatic negotiations. The Mesha Stele represents contemporary royal documentation that validates biblical historical claims through independent verification created for political rather than religious purposes. The inscription preserves factual information about military campaigns, territorial boundaries, and political relationships that biblical texts reference throughout their historical narratives. The monument demonstrates that biblical authors possessed accurate knowledge of contemporary political conditions rather than creating fictional or idealized accounts of ancient international relations. As researchers continue developing increasingly sophisticated methods for analyzing such ancient documents, they gain new tools for examining the precise timing and sequence of the scientific dating these monuments commemorate biblical timelines. While royal inscriptions provide contemporary validation of biblical events, modern scientific techniques offer an entirely different approach to confirming scriptural chronology through objective measurement rather than textual interpretation. Revolutionary radiocarbon dating methods have developed precision capabilities that researchers couldn't have imagined just a decade ago. Scientists can now measure carbon-14 decay with unprecedented accuracy, creating timelines precise to within decades rather than centuries. These advanced techniques use accelerator mass spectrometry combined with sophisticated statistical modeling to extract maximum chronological information from tiny sample sizes. The most significant breakthrough involves overcoming the Hallstatt plateau, a cosmic phenomenon that previously complicated Iron Age dating by creating atmospheric carbon, 14 fluctuations between 800 and 400 BC. This natural occurrence caused dating uncertainties that could span several centuries, allowing skeptics to argue that archaeological evidence couldn't definitively support biblical timelines. However, recent technological advances have conquered these limitations through sophisticated calibration methods and statistical analysis techniques that extract reliable dates even from problematic time periods. The validation of biblical chronology through scientific dating has emerged most clearly at Gezer, where enhanced radiocarbon methods have resolved long-standing scholarly debates about when major construction projects occurred. Archaeologists working at this biblical site have used high-precision dating techniques to analyze the monumental structures, including the famous six-chambered gate that biblical texts associate with Solomon's building activities. The radiocarbon results place construction of these massive fortifications firmly in the first half of the 10th century BC, directly supporting biblical claims that Solomon rebuilt Gezer as part of his kingdom expansion. This scientific validation contradicts scholarly theories that downdated these structures to the 9th century BC based on architectural comparisons rather than empirical evidence. The radiocarbon dates provide definitive proof that supports the biblical timeline over academic speculation that lacked scientific foundation. The Gezer Gate represents one of the most significant examples where objective scientific measurement has confirmed biblical historical claims against scholarly skepticism. The dating methodology employed at Gezer involved analyzing organic materials found in the construction layers associated with the gate complex. Researchers extracted carbon samples from charcoal fragments, carbonized seeds, and other organic residues discovered within the foundation contexts of the monumental architecture. These materials underwent accelerator mass spectrometry analysis at specialized laboratories equipped to handle ancient samples with extreme precision. The resulting radiocarbon measurements were then processed through advanced statistical algorithms that account for atmospheric variations and calibration uncertainties. The convergence of multiple radiocarbon dates from different areas of the Gezer Gate complex created a robust chronological framework that eliminates dating ambiguity. Each sample produced measurements that clustered around the same time period, creating statistical confidence that the construction occurred during the first half of the 10th century BC. The consistency of these independent measurements demonstrates that the dating results reflect genuine historical timing rather than laboratory error or contamination issues. The archaeological context surrounding these radiocarbon samples strengthens the connection between the scientific dates and the biblical historical framework. The organic materials were found in sealed construction contexts that could only have been deposited during the original building activities. The stratigraphic relationships between different construction phases provide additional confirmation that the dated materials represent the actual timing of the gate's construction rather than later repairs or modifications. The implications of the Gezer dating extend beyond this single site to validate the broader chronological framework that biblical texts assume for Solomon's reign and building activities. The scientific confirmation that major construction projects occurred during the 10th century BC supports biblical claims about the political and economic capabilities of Solomon's kingdom. The radiocarbon evidence demonstrates that Israel possessed the organizational resources and technical expertise necessary to undertake ambitious building projects during the period when biblical texts describe the height of the United Monarchy. The precision achieved through modern radiocarbon dating techniques represents a fundamental advancement in archaeological methodology that provides objective verification for historical claims. Unlike interpretive approaches that rely on subjective analysis of architectural styles or ceramic typologies, radiocarbon dating produces quantitative measurements that can be verified and replicated by independent laboratories. The scientific nature of these dating methods creates empirical evidence that operates independently of religious or cultural bias. The technological sophistication enabling these chronological breakthroughs involves laboratory procedures that extract maximum information from minimal sample materials. Accelerator mass spectrometry allows researchers to date samples containing only milligrams of organic carbon, preserving precious artifacts while obtaining precise chronological data. Advanced statistical modeling techniques process radiocarbon measurements through complex algorithms that produce probability distributions indicating the most likely date ranges with confidence intervals that approach historical certainty. The success of radiocarbon dating at Gezer demonstrates how scientific methods can resolve archaeological debates that previously relied on subjective interpretation and scholarly opinion. The objective nature of scientific measurement provides a foundation for evaluating historical claims that transcends academic disagreements and personal biases. The empirical evidence creates common ground where data validates historical assertions rather than theoretical speculation. The application of these advanced dating methods has created a paradigm shift in biblical archaeology, where scientific evidence increasingly supports traditional chronological frameworks rather than challenging them. The radiocarbon confirmation of 10th century BC construction at Gezer represents just one example of how modern scientific techniques are validating biblical historical claims through objective measurement. The convergence of scientific dating with biblical chronology demonstrates that ancient historical accounts possess empirical foundation that can be verified through independent scientific analysis. The success at Gezer suggests that similar scientific validation awaits discovery at other biblical sites where advanced dating techniques have yet to be systematically applied. As these methods become more widely available and cost-effective, researchers expect to generate additional scientific evidence that will further illuminate the relationship between biblical accounts and archaeological reality. The objective nature of scientific dating provides tools for examining historical claims that promise to reshape understanding of biblical chronology and historical accuracy. These methodological advances have transformed how researchers evaluate biblical claims through empirical evidence rather than theoretical speculation. The convergence of multiple independent discoveries demonstrates remarkable consistency between archaeological findings and scriptural accounts. The Tel Dan stele provides contemporary confirmation that King David existed as a historical ruler whose dynasty was recognized throughout the ancient Near East. The Ophel Electrum pendant validates biblical descriptions of Phoenician craftsmen working in Solomon's Jerusalem during the exact period when Scripture describes these international collaborations. Radiocarbon dating of the Gezer Gate confirms 10th century construction that supports biblical chronology for Solomon's building projects. These three discoveries represent the strongest archaeological validation of biblical historical accuracy yet discovered. Each operates independently through different methodological approaches, yet consistently supports scriptural claims rather than contradicting them. Future excavations promise additional revelations as new technologies and systematic exploration continue illuminating the ancient world. Check the description below for detailed information about these discoveries and ongoing research.